Good morning. I'm James Galbraith. I'm the chair of the Board of Economists for Peace and Security, and I would like to welcome you to this symposium on the war in Afghanistan, problems and prospects in the wake of Karzai's visit. I would like, first of all, to thank and to very cordially thank our partners in this endeavor, the New America Foundation, and particularly Steve Clemens, who is here, whose help in organizing and advertising this event has been utterly invaluable. I'd like to thank the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center for making this facility available to us. It's a very pleasant facility, and I would like to welcome the audience who is here live and also the audience who are joining us online through the web streaming on the Washington Note. Economists for Peace and Security is a professional network of economists based here in the United States with affiliates in many countries around the world. Our primary mission is to call attention to the costs of war and to urge that the pursuit of security be conducted in a way that seeks for paths that reduce violence, de-escalate conflict, and spare blood and treasure. We recognize that sometimes wars cannot be avoided and that some missions should be seen through. But experience also teaches that this is not true of all conflicts, and that it is better to disengage from a futile and fruitless mission than to persist when the costs exceed the possibility of gain. It's in this spirit that we're convening the symposium this morning to take up the issue of the Afghanistan war. We have two expert panels, one of which I think will be largely concerned with the circumstances and costs of the conflict itself, and which is composed of very senior and distinguished experts who spend a great deal of time reflecting on these issues. And the second of which will try to set this question in the larger strategic and economic context. And our view in doing that is that it is exceptionally important when faced with a series, not just one, but a series of security challenges, that they be considered together and in light of the priorities and demands on the resources of the larger society. In other words, that we have a discussion about those things which are most important to attempt to achieve. And that will be, I hope, the function of the second panel, also composed of people with real depth of experience and knowledge in thinking about these larger economic and strategic questions. Between the two panels, we will have a keynote speaker, an individual with recent diplomatic experience in Afghanistan and a long career of work in combat zones. That will be Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who happens also to be my brother. We will be conducting this event in the style to which those of you who are in the habit of attending or listening to New America Foundation events have become accustomed. That is to say, in nonstop fashion with essentially a tense force march movement from the beginning to the end. And we hope in that way both hold the attention of the audience here, hold the attention of our online audience, and to have as much meaningful and important discussion of these issues as we can in the limited time that we have available. So having said that, I would like now to invite the first panel to take the stage. And that panel is being chaired by Michael Lend of the New America Foundation.
Good morning. Thank you, and thanks to Economists for Peace and Security for allowing us at a New America Foundation to co-sponsor this one in a series of very enlightening and provocative events that EPS has put on. The subject of the first session this morning, unnecessary and counterproductive. We'll be looking at the Afghan war, both in itself and in the context of U.S. grand strategy. And to help us think our way through this, we have some of the most provocative and insightful foreign policy thinkers in the United States. Paul Pillar, Matthew Ho, Hilary Mann Leverett, Steve Clemens, and Thomas Andrews. For those of you present, we have longer biographies on the materials that you've been presented with. In order to get directly to the discussion, I'll give you sort of abbreviated versions. Paul Pillar retired in 2005 from a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, in which his last position was a national intelligence officer for the Near East and South Asia. He's been executive assistant to CIA's Deputy Director for Intelligence and executive assistant to Director of Central Intelligence, William Webster. Matthew Ho is a former State Department official who resigned in protest from his own post in Afghanistan over disagreements about U.S. strategic policy and goals in Afghanistan in September 2009. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, he served in Iraq. When not deployed, Matthews worked on Afghanistan and Iraq policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 2008. He is recently named the 2010 Reidenhauer Prize recipient for truth-telling. Hilary Mann Leverett is a CEO of Stratega. In the Bush administration, Leverett worked as the director for Iran, Afghanistan, and Persian Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council, Middle East specialist on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and is political advisor for Middle East, Central Asian, and African issues for the U.S. mission to the United Nations. From 2001 to 2003, she was one of a small number of U.S. diplomats authorized to negotiate with the Iranians over Afghanistan, al-Qaeda, and Iraq. My colleague Steve Clemens directs the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, and he's a publisher of the popular political blog, The Washington Note. He served as executive vice president of the Economic Strategy Institute, a senior policy advisor on economic and international affairs to Senator Jeff Bingaman, and was the first executive director of the Nixon Center. And Thomas Andrews, the Honorable Thomas Andrews, is the executive director of New Security Action, a 501c4 advocacy organization. He also serves as national director of the Win Without War Coalition and is senior advisor to the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. As a member of Congress, Andrews served as president of his freshman class, a deputy majority whip, and a member of the House Armed Services Committee. So clearly a very impressive lineup to address this issue. We'll go in the order in which I introduced the panelists, beginning with Paul Pillar of Georgetown University.
Thank you, and good morning. In the beginning, since I have the beginning. We need to remember why we are in, or supposedly why we are in Afghanistan to begin with. It's supposed to be all about terrorism. We intervened with Operation Enduring Freedom as a direct response to the 9/11 terrorist attack now 9 years ago. Much has changed, of course, since then. Al-Qaeda, which had a haven and a partnership with the Afghan Taliban, has been subjected to harder times since then. It's no longer there, except for a few operatives. But our goal, according to the President, now is to prevent the reestablishment of a terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan. So the important point is, in evaluating the wisdom and effectiveness of the expedition to Afghanistan, we need to measure it in terms of how much it is reducing the chance that Americans will fall victim to terrorist violence. It is not about shaping a particular political and social order in Afghanistan, which was never a vital U.S. interest, or an interest that would warrant any significant expenditure of U.S. resources. And it's not about winning a counterinsurgency or achieving any other specific military outcome, because to talk in those terms would be to confuse means with ends. Winning a counterinsurgency is not an end in itself. So the key question underlying all of our discussion about this effort is what we're doing in Afghanistan achieving enough of a reduction in the terrorist threat to Americans to warrant the cost, both the direct costs in blood and treasure and the indirect ones as well? Others will be speaking more about the costs. My principal point I want to leave you with is about the benefits. And that is that whatever protection from terrorism that is being gained through our efforts in Afghanistan is, in my judgment, nowhere near what would warrant the cost that we are sustaining, and may even be a net zero or possibly worse. And in support of that, let me make several observations. One is the one I already alluded to. Al-Qaeda itself is no longer in Afghanistan. To the extent it has a safe haven, it's across the other side of the Duran line in Pakistan. And if they lost that, there would be any number of places that could serve as safe havens, the Somalias, the Yemens, and elsewhere. And even more fundamentally than that, if they didn't have a physical territorial safe haven, it would not necessarily make, and in my judgment probably would not make, an appreciable difference in the threat that that or any other terrorist group poses. And all we need to do is think about the preparations for something like 9/11 itself, most of which took place not in Afghanistan or Pakistan, but in places like Hamburg and Spain, and most notably flight schools here in the United States. Note, the question is not, do terrorists make use of safe havens? They do. It's not even, is a safe haven useful to a terrorist group? It is. The question is, how much incremental difference does it make to the threat that it poses? How much more above and beyond the threat the group would already be posing, safe haven or no safe haven? That is the standard against which the costs need to be measured. Now, we've gotten into a conflict in the current counterinsurgency in which we aren't fighting al-Qaeda. We're fighting a surrogate enemy, most of which goes under the label of Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. The Afghan Taliban is not a transnational terrorist group like al-Qaeda. Its goals are not the goals of al-Qaeda. It is one of the most insular, inward-looking bands of people anywhere. They are concerned with how things are ordered and run in Afghanistan, not what takes place outside the borders of Afghanistan, and we are a concern to them only insofar as we affect the social and political ordering of things inside Afghanistan. Beyond that, they probably couldn't care less about us. We are making enemies as we pursue the campaign. Many of the people who have taken up arms in Afghanistan have no sympathy at all for the ideological extremism we associate with the Afghan Taliban leadership. Many of them barely qualify for the title Taliban, and indeed the U.S. military, in describing the foe in some firefights, has appropriately described them as something else, like armed militias or armed tribal elements, or not even Taliban. The main motivation has been to rid the country of what is seen as a foreign occupation, not to pursue a particular ideological goal that we associate with the Afghan Taliban, much less to support the broader transnational goals of someone like bin Laden. Now, against these realities, some have observed that, well, we're really there because of what's going to happen on the other side of the Durand line, Pakistan. And we have this tendency to think in sort of spatial terms, that if something's happening in one country then that's bad and that represents instability, it's inevitably going to sort of spill over, kind of like the oozing red paint of the Cold War imagery, into the next country. Well, there will be some effects, perhaps, but I dare say that the most important determinants of what happens inside Pakistan will be inside Pakistan itself. And if we want a take on how events in Afghanistan affect stability and stabilization efforts inside Pakistan, we can listen to the Pakistani authorities themselves, who have pointed out such things as that U.S. military success on the Afghan side of the Durand line, to the extent that we have success, may have just the untoward effect of pushing extremists across the line and making the Pakistanis' job of trying to stabilize their northwest even more difficult. And finally, there is the ultimate irony here, of course, and that is that the Pakistanis, despite an arrest here or there, continue to do business with the Afghan Taliban, which they have considered one of their tools and allies for many years, as a way of keeping their finger in the Afghan pie. And so it would be paradoxical, to say the least, to say that we are fighting this enemy to support someone else who in turn is doing business with that same enemy. I close with this thought. I realize that we are not talking about what we should have done in Afghanistan 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 9 years ago. It's where we go from here. But I would say that we still need the same sort of clear-headed thinking about costs and benefits in terms of where we go from here, as has always been the case. And we should resist two tendencies in particular. One, resist the tendency to think of sunken costs as investments, even though that's a common human tendency and it's come up with previous U.S. wars. And we need to resist the tendency to treat a particular victorious military outcome, be it in counterinsurgency or any other mode of warfare, as an end in itself. It is not. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for coming out on this rainy Monday morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel. I also hope everyone excuses my allergies. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the room who can sympathize with that. Briefly, what I'll discuss is my 4 points of contention with our strategy in Afghanistan, and then a bit of what I recommend. And I think it's going to dovetail quite well with the rest of the panelists here this morning. The first point, and as Paul just discussed, was that our presence in Al-Qaeda, our presence in Afghanistan has no effect on Al-Qaeda. And I won't elaborate on Paul's comments, but basically this is a loosely structured organization that operates worldwide with individuals and small cells. And our response to that is deploying 100,000 ground troops in a country that they're not even in. And so I'll leave that point at that because I think it's pretty obvious. The second point, and I'm sure our keynote speaker today will elaborate further on this one as well, is the moral aspect of our operations in Afghanistan. The fact that the Karzai regime is a corrupt and illegitimate government. I took part in the elections this past summer, and I can tell you with utter sincerity and certainty that those elections were stolen. I can, also tell you the United States spent $200 million on those elections, and at this time last year, we were rushing tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers to ensure there were going to be free and fair elections, and there weren't. So there's a component of this, a moral one, one of 10 or 15 years from now, if we have, and we will have a monument for this war. It'll probably take longer than 10 or 15 years to build, but like everything else does. But will we be standing in front of that monument and saying these lives were worth what they were sacrificed for? Did they die in support of a kleptocracy? Did they die in support of a regime that did not benefit its people and whose interests were not in any way, shape, or form in line with the interests of the United States? The third and fourth points tend to agree with one another. The first of these latter is that we're taking part in what is in effect a 35-year-old civil war. And there's different elements to this and different layers, and just like any other part of the world, the society is very complex. But there is a civil war that has existed just probably a couple academics in this room who can go into much greater detail than I can, but has gone on for generations, literally into spanning centuries. And this is a conflict between the Pashto-speaking peoples and the Dari-speaking peoples, the Pashtuns versus those who compose the northern tribes, the Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaras. There's also another dimension of this conflict in this society, the split between urban and rural, between the secular and the religious, between the progressive and the traditional, between the educated and the uneducated, is immense. And it's a split that actually is a cause or is one of the main elements of conflict there. So you have this split between the urban and the rural, and if you really want to be simplistic about it, you can think of it in terms of our own split here in this country between red states and blue states, that it comes down to in issues of values, in issues of lifestyle, in issues of culture, things that will not be bridged by building new roads, health clinics, schools, etc., that these are issues that go much deeper and actually touch the soul of the people that they involve. And then the third one is within Pashtun society itself, there is a split as well. And if you go back and you read like the old books the English wrote from their time in Afghanistan in the 19th century, you'll see a reference to the mountain and the valley Pashtuns. And again, this is similar to that second split I described. It falls along urban and rural lines. And there's also tribal dimensions in it too, between the two main tribes within Pashtun society. But even that's not perfect, and that's very muddled, particularly after 35 years of war. There are not clear tribal lines within Afghanistan any longer, but it's just a very complicated, conflicted society. And as a Westerner serving there, the best thing you can do is understand that and recognize it and understand that things are not simply as black and white as we would like them to believe. Now, what this means and what the problem is for the United States where we're at is that in 2001, and if you look at the media from 2001, you'll see that it's continuously referenced as a civil war in Afghanistan. After 2001, the references to the civil war went away, and it wasn't until recently that the media, I think, started referring to it again as a civil war within Afghanistan. What happened, though, was you had one side, the side represented by the Taliban, versus the other side, the side represented by the Northern Alliance. We came in 2001 and replaced the Taliban with the Northern Alliance, but we didn't address those underlying political causes of the conflict, those underlying root causes why these two sides were fighting each other, why one side of the nation was fighting the other side. We did not resolve those issues. And in fact, through the bond process and through the process for which we formed a new government in Afghanistan, we actually excluded a large segment of that losing side from the government, and that's one of the roots of the problem right now. That's one of the causes that people support the Taliban, is because they're not included in the government. They are outside of it. They are excluded from the process. They are excluded from a number of different things, but one of it is involvement in the government. And then finally, the last point is quite simply that the people that are fighting us in the East, the people that are fighting us and in the South, are fighting us because we're occupying them. It's very simple. If we were not in those valleys, they would not be fighting us. If we were, there are places in both the East and the South where we have a presence where the only reason they are attacking our troops is because our troops are there. If we pull out of those valleys, those people are not about to line up on the street or line up on the road and march and take Kabul. It's a very insular, valley and village-oriented culture there. What matters is what happens within your valley. So what we find is that our occupation is the source of the rebellion as opposed to anything else. Now this gets to, the title is Unnecessary and Counterproductive, and I think I'm falling more on the lines of counterproductive. But the idea being that if the cause of the problem, if the cause of support, of popular support for the Taliban, and I use that term in very much its broadest sense, because the Taliban is a collection of a lot of different groups. If the problem is foreign occupation and a corrupt and unrepresentative government, well, then why was our solution to the problem to add more troops and to expand a corrupt and unrepresentative government? So what we're really doing is just adding fuel to the proverbial fire. I've been calling for a ceasefire within the country because the actions our troops are taking in the valleys are not accomplishing anything, that they are just engendering more violence. I called for honest negotiations with senior leadership of the Taliban, because they do represent, even though they probably wouldn't be supported if we were not there, they do represent a large portion of the population in terms of their effects among in the South and in the East. And then, of course, a reformation of the Afghan government to bring in those who are excluded from it, so i.e. the rural Pashtuns. Excuse me. I'll leave it there in terms of my recommendations. I'm sure we'll get to that later in the day. But again, I appreciate everyone's time this morning and look forward to the discussion after our remarks.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you, Steve Clemens, for inviting me in particular. I'm going to start this morning with looking at Afghanistan through the prism of our relations with Hamid Karzai. And I may differ a bit from my colleague who just spoke. I'm going to focus first on Obama's recent trip to Afghanistan and Karzai's recent trip to Washington, and just remind everybody that these two trips put on graphic display the dizzying pendulum swings that have come to characterize this administration, the Obama administration's policy toward Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan more broadly. But underlining the administration's approach to Karzai, I think, is a deeper strategic problem. That problem is America's war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and I again use the term Taliban broadly and as shorthand for the multitude of groups, but America's war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan was not, is not, and will never be Hamid Karzai's war. This is a basic fact that I think many in Washington refuse to really accept. It is important to remember why Hamid Karzai was initially selected as president of Afghanistan back in 2001 and what he continues to bring to the table. At the time, back in 2001, when I was working on these issues, both as a political advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN in New York and then later here at the White House, despite some of the rhetoric, there was no consensus within the U.S. government or at the United Nations. And remember, the United Nations was formally charged with forming this first post-Taliban government. There was no consensus that to remake Afghanistan into some economically prosperous bastion of stability that would be capable of preventing another 9/11 attack. Even in the Bush administration, there was no consensus of that kind of theoretical approach. In fact, the UN Special Representative at the time, Lakhdar Brahimi, with whom I worked closely, his model was not to rebuild Afghanistan. It wasn't maybe some of the other peacekeeping models at the time, like East Timor. It wasn't that at all. It was his experience working on Lebanon after the civil war in Lebanon. It was his background in trying to put together the Taif Accord, which ended the civil war in Lebanon, by putting together a process of internal political reconciliation and power sharing. And note, I'm not saying reintegration, but political reconciliation and power sharing among the various Afghan factions with the critical buy-in of the most important external players in the Lebanese civil war. That was the model. So when the UN came together in Bonn to put together this first post-Taliban government in December 2001, nearly none of the 30-plus ministers in that first government, including Hamid Karzai himself, nearly none of them was selected for their track record or even potential for good governance, advancing women's rights, or building even a genuinely national Afghan military or police. Karzai in particular was not selected to serve as Afghanistan's president because he had any significant military background, let alone management experience, or even significant government service. Karzai was chosen as Afghanistan's first post-Taliban president for two basic reasons. One, he is Pashtun, from an important tribe. And the idea at the time was that it was too toxic, unacceptable, particularly to the United States, to have someone who was affiliated with, let alone part of, the Taliban. But Karzai was this conciliatory figure who was Pashtun from an important tribe who could lay the foundation for bringing in other Pashtuns, 42% of the population, at a later time when that would be necessary for political reconciliation. This was a critically important point, particularly for Lakhdar Brahimi. The new Afghan president needed to be able to serve as a focal point for national reconciliation. This reconciliation would need to be achieved through carefully negotiated power-sharing arrangements, encompassing the range of Afghanistan's ethnic, sectarian, and tribal groups. Again, of the 30-odd ministers in that first post-Taliban government that was put together in December 2001, nearly all of the ministers, including those responsible for the military and security forces, were appointed because of their ability to pacify their ethnic, sectarian, and tribal groups and bring them into a process of political reconciliation. It was in this context that Karzai was selected as president, again, because he was seen as a prospectively conciliatory figure with assets that could be valuable for post-conflict stabilization. Though he's Pashtun, he was seen as someone who could work constructively with representatives of non-Pashtun groups, including some of Afghanistan's most powerful, even vicious warlords. And while he had supported the U.S. military campaign in 2001, he was not seen as an ardent Taliban foe, even back in 2001. So those who are surprised to hear his rhetoric today about joining the Taliban don't really remember the historical record of Taliban's service Karzai's service in the Taliban government and his ability to work with them previously. This is what Karzai brings to the table: an interest in political reconciliation and power sharing among Afghans with buy-in from their key international backers. The problem is the United States has never had the stomach to stick with this strategy. They've never had the stomach to actually deal with the Taliban and the insurgents and build a power sharing agreement that would give any of these people real power in Afghanistan. We've never had the stomach to believe it, to see this through, but I believe this is the only realistic way forward for Afghanistan: political reconciliation and power sharing with each of Afghanistan's most powerful factions and their external backers. The Obama administration's attempt to split hairs here and agree to only political reintegration rather than political reconciliation and power sharing of the Taliban is fantasy at best. It depends on two false assumptions. One, that the Taliban can be defeated militarily, and two, that the Taliban don't realize, and again, I use the Taliban as a term to broadly characterize the various insurgent groups. It also depends on the Taliban not realizing that they would be politically irrelevant if they agreed to essentially American conditions for reintegration. That's why this wasn't even tried in Lebanon. Can you imagine Hezbollah having agreed to any of the kind of conditions we put on the Taliban to stop the fighting in Lebanon? Nobody would have believed that back in the late 1980s about Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we shouldn't buy into it today for Afghanistan. That's at best that it's fantasy. At worst, refusing to agree to political reconciliation and power sharing contributes to the continuing civil war by empowering the Taliban and other insurgents to fight in a way that they see as a zero-sum fight to the finish. And with U.S. troops withdrawing come next July, or what I hope will be U.S. troops withdrawing come next July, starting to withdraw, the Obama administration will, sooner or later, need to embrace precisely what Karzai can offer: national reconciliation through negotiated power-sharing arrangements. The Obama administration needs to set aside, once and for all, the delusion that the Taliban can be, quote-unquote, reintegrated into an Afghanistan that can be stabilized through domestic transformation along Western lines. That's simply not going to happen. Instead, we should be supporting Karzai, and not for his personality, but we should be supporting him in his pursuit of what I see as the most urgent challenge facing Afghanistan. That is bringing the Taliban to the negotiating table with other Afghan factions, while at the same time keeping the most strongly anti-Taliban elements at the table too. This requires not only a focused, deft policy on internal politics in Afghanistan, it also requires a rigorous, serious diplomatic strategy to elicit the cooperation of the Afghan faction's most important external backers. There's been a lot of talk about Pakistan, but one of the key backers here that needs to be supported through Karzai is bringing Saudi Arabia into this process in a constructive, effective, transparent manner. We need to support Karzai's efforts to reach out to Saudi Arabia and to others who have longstanding ties to the Taliban, who can help to enlist their help in incentivizing their cooperation in any kind of power-sharing agreement. Again, the Saudis were instrumental in Lebanon too. We sometimes forget that. In addition to Saudi Arabia, and I'd say critically important at the same time to support Karzai's efforts with Saudi Arabia, we need to stop criticizing Karzai for trying to build a constructive relationship to Iran. Washington needs to support Karzai's efforts to reach out to Tehran. This is essential if Iran is to be persuaded to accept the Taliban's inclusion in a political settlement, while at the same time using Afghan groups to which Iran has ties as a long-term check on the extent of the Taliban's power and reach. People seem to think we can just pick up on the dialogue that we had, the negotiations we had with Iran over Afghanistan from 2001 to 2003. That is not the case. From 2001 to 2003, our interests and Iran's interests in sidelining the Taliban, at least for that period of time, were very close together. Today, they're not. Iran will need to be persuaded to allow the Taliban to come to the table and not see it as a zero-sum game. Under the best of circumstances, engaging Iran as part of this regional strategy, a diplomatic strategy for Afghanistan, a strategy which of necessity must also encompass Iran's arch rivals, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. That would be a daunting diplomatic challenge under the best of circumstances. Now remember, back in the 2001 to 2003 period, Pakistan was essentially on its knees, and Saudi Arabia was not a player because we focused on the fact that several of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi. So they were effectively sidelined. To bring Saudi Arabia in particular into the process today will require very focused, very serious diplomacy with Iran. But at a time when Washington is working overtime to expand both the multilateral and unilateral U.S. sanctions against the Islamic Republic, the chances of successful U.S.-Iranian engagement over Afghanistan are extremely poor. Even though they're extremely poor, it is still critically essential to pursue this path. Failure to pursue this kind of diplomatic strategy for Afghanistan runs a real risk that the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan over the next few years will leave an environment that is all too conducive to a proxy war among Afghanistan's neighbors and other key regional states. If we think that it's chaotic there now, just wait until Iran and Saudi Arabia decide to have their proxy war there. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much. I want to thank Jamie Galbraith and the Economists for Peace and Security for doing this with the New America Foundation, and I want to thank so many of my colleagues and friends for playing a role today. We thought it would be important to begin trying to take the Afghanistan question and put it in a larger context for folks. There tends to be in many areas, whether you're talking about Israel, Palestine, or Iran, or our issues with China, or whatever, a siloization of issues, a tendency to look at some challenge facing the United States only within the kind of very narrow terms there, and not, I think, as Hilary Mann and Paul Pillar and others, Matthew, have tried to sort of bust out of that and look at some of the other pieces. I'm honored today to mention later in the next panel we have Mike Intriligator here. Mike Intriligator was my mentor, one of my mentors many years ago, UCLA, and I used to do a lot of economic modeling with Mike. I ran something called the Marshak Colloquium on interdisciplinary colloquium on mathematics and the behavioral sciences. That's a long way of saying we had more Nobel Prize to be people coming in through, but when you would listen to these people focus and think about mathematically modeling social behavior, political behavior, biological behavior, the way clouds moved, the way international relations worked, you got a sense that there were a lot of moving pieces. And what I find in Washington is we tend to neglect as many of those moving pieces as possible and not look at them. And I would like to kind of get beyond Afghanistan just for a moment and look at some of the other broader issues that I think are neglected when we have discussions about U.S. foreign policy and what's happening in the culture of these discussions today. In part, what's been happening both in Democratic Party circles and Republican Party circles is a decline of those players who think in cost-benefit terms, i.e. realist terms. Even my friends on the liberal internationalist side who tend to think about structure and deliverables and costs and consequences of different approaches. You could go back to Dwight Eisenhower and the solarium exercise that he did, in which he commissioned 3 competing groups to look at what they would bring to various to the Soviet challenge facing the United States and how they would deal with it over time. These 3 competing teams played out before Eisenhower and his national security staff, and they had to pay essentially for their worldview in very systematic ways over a long time. That has not been happening when you look at Afghanistan. When I look at American power and the precipitous decline that it has gone through over the last several years, and you look at the economic, the military, the moral dimensions of power, all of these to some degree, without casting blame, have nonetheless, we've shown key limits. We've shown key military limits, I think, in Iraq that's cast doubt, and you can see the way in which allies have changed their behavior. Forget Iran, North Korea, and the foes, but look at classic allies. Israel, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Germany have all rebuffed the United States under this administration in key and fundamental ways, and there's a sense that U.S. power is different. We managed to export toxic financial products to the rest of the world, thus throwing into question our economic leadership. Abu Ghraib, Bagram, Guantanamo, and others continue to be this day a very large recruiting mechanism for terrorists and terror networks around the world, also casting into debate America's moral leadership. That's before you get into military commissions and domestic spying and whatnot. And that brings us to what I think Barack Obama is trying to do on a number of fronts, which is through ideas and institutions, essentially try to create momentum in certain areas. I've been a great fan of what the President has done on the nuclear nonproliferation side of things. I think probably differ somewhat from Hillary on this front, but trying to move that through. And that brings us to something like Afghanistan and ask ourselves fundamentally, does Afghanistan and our engagement there contribute to a sense of America regaining and reestablishing itself, or are we stuck in something that continues to sort of sap the sense that American power and sap the sense that America has the ability to sculpt the global order in a way that's beneficial to others, or that it can even in a multilateral sense get back this sculpting? And that is in the context in which I look and worry about Afghanistan today. As I see Afghanistan as something that basically saps and traps American power, not as something that enhances and builds American power. If you identify Iran, for instance, and again, I have slight differences with Hillary, but you can sort of look at Iran. If you were going to animate and change the way Iran's leadership looked at its choices and the way it looked at the world, I would say that if you were somehow simultaneously able to get Israel and Palestine on a credible two-track and lead to a normalization strategy between Israel and Arab states, that fundamentally is an opportunity for an ASEAN regional forum like rewriting of security relationships in the Middle East in the favor of those that would be worried about. That's one element. A second element would to bring China and Russia in with us, as I think Obama's been trying to with limited success. My colleague Flint Leverett thinks it's not going nearly as well as the administration thinks it is in the moment. But then you would also look at Afghanistan. And if you see the way you were, if you were Iran and you knew that you had been part of the Hillary Mann Leverett, Zal Khalilzad, James Dobbins approach before, and you had been wired in to what was going on, and you saw that come undone, and you saw both the larger commitment of U.S. troops, but you realized that rather than this being an expression of strength, was beginning to look like weakness. That translates as weakness. If you see Benjamin Netanyahu, rightly or wrongly, play the role that he did, where essentially he became the Khrushchev for this administration, showing the limits of Barack Obama, not the strength of Barack Obama, again, this is another key factor that figures into, I think, Iran's choices. So it's affecting Iran's choices that I think are very important, in which we tend not to look at the debilitating aspects of an engagement in Afghanistan that seems to be in my view, getting worse rather than better. At New America Foundation, I work with two of the leading thoughtful scholars, thinkers, players in U.S. Afghan policy, Steve Call, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the book Ghost Wars, and Peter Bergen, of course, who's, our famous al-Qaeda tracker, bin Laden tracker and whatnot. And the two of them have been more supportive of the administration's course and direction in Afghanistan than I have. But we've had a respectful debate. But this week, possibly today, the New Yorker magazine will print a piece by Steve Call that essentially argues that the administration is completely and remains completely politically inchoate when it comes to these issues. And this has been my concern for a long time, that I'm not a pacifist. If you could find a way to move in, neutralize the Taliban, stabilize Afghanistan, create rapprochement between India and Pakistan in the deal, which is what Steve Call had been hoping for, and do all of that in a cohesive way, and thus create momentum and to some degree enhance the sense of American power, I would be for it. But I just don't believe it. I see some folks in the military here. I have other friends in the military. I talk to military leaders all the time, and they have a much greater debate amongst themselves about these issues than I think happens in official Washington. There's a great diversity of views about how to achieve these things. Just last week, right before the Karzai summit here in Washington began, Nancy Pelosi brought back with her a group of leading women members of Congress. And I have great respect for Nancy Pelosi, Donna Edwards, and some of the other members of that team. But when they came back, I saw a very deft move that really bothered me about the change in mission when it came to thinking about why the United States is engaged in Afghanistan and what it's all about, to come back somewhat to what Paul Pillar was saying. And Donna Edwards, whom I really do like very much, made a statement about American national security, saying that you can justify, that you can benchmark American national security in terms of the benchmarks of how we see the change in women's lives and circumstances in Afghanistan. I am absolutely in favor of women's rights and trying to use whatever statecraft and mechanisms we can to try to improve that world. I'm definitively opposed to thinking that the U.S. military is either the appropriate vehicle or the right place to do all of this. What's happened is that over a period of time, the United States military, which has such capacity to deliver on so many fronts, is looked at as the only institution with teeth and resources that can move. We recently at the New America Foundation invited Tony Zinni to come in and talk about state building, of which he's really not very much a fan anymore. He's been on almost every state building commission, but in his experiences with USAID and the State Department, he believes that the incapacity, that the incompetence, the lack of thinking about simulations and all of the things that get built into the way in which the Pentagon looks at and thinks about and theorizes about big challenges out there, other institutions of government simply are in their DNA unable to do. And he made a provocative comment, which I found provocative. I sort of instinctively oppose, but he raised the fundamental bar in the question, which is he suggested that we remove the civil affairs units outside of all the various commands in the Pentagon and unite them into one single-owned, standalone command, and then situate organizations like USID and state next to them so that they could learn how to do the business. And it was provocative. I heard from John Hamry at CSIS and many others, but he was raising the point that when we are engaged in these kinds of things, they end up becoming more bureaucratic knots tied here that reflect more about our own either our own flaming interests politically, where we have neoconservatives on the right or liberal interventionists on the left, driven by their own sympathies and what they want to see play out in U.S. foreign policy, not necessarily a cost-benefit assessment of what would drive American power forward, or alternatively, we're tied in political knots here at home in terms of the way bureaucracies see their vision and mission. And I think it's in that context we need to be very careful and think about the kinds of gestures we take next, either in removing ourselves from Afghanistan or doubling down. We are spending today more than $100 billion when you look at all the receipts that will come up for the current level of deployments that are committed to Afghanistan. And that is in a country, forget purchasing power parity, because I don't believe it exists in Afghanistan, with a $12 billion GDP, $100 billion annual expense, larger than the annual cost of health care reform, in a country that in an engagement, at least thus right now, that I think is weakening the perception of American power rather than strengthening it. So I will just leave you, and I look forward to the discussion, that to try to break out of the box of just thinking about the country at hand and what's achieved, and look at the consequential downdraft of these issues. Also look at the nuts and bolts of how we're achieving things. I think Zinni made a very provocative comment, and that to some degree, when you look at a military engagement, if it were to be justified and done, we ought to be very humble and very cautious about continuing to allow a mission creep in that set of objectives, and make the U.S. military more and more tied to whatever political whim we may have that is completely disconnected from the reasons that we originally went in. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
Good morning, everyone. I'm bringing my watch because, as you heard from the introduction, I used to serve in Congress. I'm a recovering politician, so at any minute I can break into a political speech. So I'm going to be timing myself to make sure that that doesn't happen. I want to also thank Economists for Peace and Security and the New America Foundation for hosting this forum. I think it's extraordinarily important that we have precisely this kind of discussion, but that we have even more of these discussions in a variety of forums, both on Capitol Hill and throughout the United States, to grapple with this question of the U.S. Policy in Afghanistan. And I think Paul, as he so often has, struck the nail on the head when he addressed the strategic context of this question in the context of U.S. security. Does the escalation, the military escalation in Afghanistan, make America and Americans safer? So it's so easy to get involved in the tactical weed debate about this or that tactical, military, or diplomatic or developmental approach in Afghanistan, but we need to keep our eye on the strategic ball and continue to ask the question, are we in fact, through our actions in Afghanistan, protecting and promoting the national security interests of the United States? I was fascinated by a comment that was made by the man who became the Russian ambassador to Afghanistan, Mr. Zamir Kabulov, who was a KGB agent in Kabul during the 1980s. Mr. Kabulov told the New York Times that, and I'm quoting here, the United States has already repeated all of our mistakes in Afghanistan and has now moved on to make mistakes of its own, ones for which we do not have the copyright. And he said this, and he says, of all the problems that he, as a KGB agent and now as an ambassador, could identify with the Soviet strategy in Afghanistan. It came down to this, and I'm quoting, "The more foreign troops you have roaming this country, the more irritative allergy toward them is going to be provoked." And when this escalation, this current escalation is completed, the United States will have nearly as many troops in Afghanistan as the Soviet Union had at the height of its military occupation. I want to talk, of course, the idea here with this military escalation is to create the conditions in which there can be peace and stability in Afghanistan. That's the rationale. I think there's compelling arguments to be made, as we've heard from Paul and from Matt Howe and others, that in fact we could be having exactly the opposite effect. But I would like to talk a little bit about the political context or climate here in the United States and the dynamic here in the United States that is really going to determine whether or not this policy is allowed to continue. You know, it's very interesting. I'm a student of news coverage, and I remember during our organizing efforts to try to stop the invasion of Iraq how difficult it was to get an airing in the mainstream media of opposing views to invading Iraq, and what an important role the mainstream media played in influencing the terms of the debate and public opinion. So I follow the news coverage and look in its trends how we might then look at the political climate here in the United States. And I found that when we, in the coverage of Afghanistan, it was very interesting to see when the new escalation was announced, and of course the first target was Marja, and there was a lot of publicity. General McChrystal, General Petraeus took great pains to embed reporters in that conflict, to hold news conferences on the scene. There was going to be a security for Marja, and then a government in a box was going to pop up and provide the kind of stability that would be required to regain the trust of the people of Afghanistan. And then it was on to Kandahar. And when and I was just reviewing some old newspapers about that back in February, about that assault. And the New York Times treated it this way. Dexter Filkins, in a Sunday New York Times piece, he said, I'm quoting here, "Have the Americans and their allies at last regained the initiative in Afghanistan?" Because remember, this is a new strategy, a new focus, a plan that was going to be able to give the United States success. After 4 long years, the initiative has returned to the Americans, Mr. Filkins reported in the New York Times. And if you see the New York Times this morning, and if you look at the front page, there's a very different article about Marja. And if you, with respect to the rise of the Taliban, the fact that they have re-seized momentum in that country. And if you look at back in a New York Times story on April 4th, Major James Kaufman of the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines had this to say: the Taliban has re-seized control. They have re-seized momentum in northern Marja. And when they asked Brigadier General Larry Nicholson, who was the commander of a brigade in Marja, his view of why this is, he said, and I'm quoting, "We've got to reevaluate our definition of the word enemy. Most people here identify themselves as Taliban." And in fact, a report issued to the Congress, required a quarterly report from the Pentagon, confirmed this. Of the 100, this is the Pentagon's own report, of the 121 districts that the United States military has identified as key terrain for stabilizing Afghanistan, the Afghan people support or are sympathetic to the insurgency in 92 of them. In 92 of 121. And they want to talk about the failed efforts to strengthen and build and train the Afghan army because of high attrition and low retention rates. And they go on to say that a key to the strength of the Taliban is, and I'm quoting here, a ready supply of recruits that's being drawn from a frustrated population where insurgents exploit poverty, tribal friction, and a lack of governance to grow their ranks. It's very interesting to also read in yesterday and today's Washington Post the story of Kamdesh and the assault on our battalion there in Camp Desh. Eight of our forces were killed in this attack. But it's very interesting. We pulled out after that attack occurred. And if you listen to the commanders who were there and you listen to their analysis of not only the battle but what happened after the retreat, Colonel Robert Brown, who's quoted in the Washington Post story, said this, quote, "If you pull out the coalition forces, you open up the natural seams between the traditional leaders and the Johnny-come-lately Taliban. His patrolling troops," according to him, and I'm quoting, "were just providing a recruitment tool for the insurgency." So you have to ask the fundamental question, as Paul has alluded to. What is motivating the insurgency in Afghanistan? Is it to turn their country into an international haven for terrorists? Or is it to rid their country of what they see of a foreign military occupying power? And almost to ask the question is to answer it. Almost to ask it is to answer it. But ladies and gentlemen, our policy in Afghanistan today is built upon the first assumption. And the escalation is all about creating conditions that would be brought about through increasing military footprint in a country that time and report again is proving to be absolutely the opposite of the case. The political dynamic here in the United States, I think, is critical. If you look at the polling, you found that when the president made his announcement of the new Afghanistan policy, people wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. There was a spike of support for the policy. A Washington Post ABC poll that was published 2 weeks ago says that now a majority of the American public believe that the war in Afghanistan is in fact not worth it. And so you have with the three core factors that are occurring that I think is going to change this political dynamic. First of all, people are now very increasingly skeptical of this war. Secondly, news reporting is changing. We're starting to get a more critical look at the war. And thirdly, the American people are becoming more and more conscious of the cost of the war, as so much of our attention and focus, particularly in this election year, is on the runaway budget of the United States. Those three factors, I think, are driving a change in the political dynamic. And of course, there was an irony here. Someone said, well, why is it that in that same poll it showed that 56% of the Americans believe that the president is, they agree with his policy in Afghanistan? How is it that 52% believe it's not worth it, but 56% believe that they agree with the policy? Well, frankly, there's several reasons for that, but the most important is that this is the one policy that the Republicans are not, of the president, the Republicans are not beating him up on every single day. It's the one area that they support. Republicans nationally, only 12% support the president's policies, but 42% support the president's policy in Afghanistan. So let sleeping dogs lie, perhaps. At least we're not getting beat up on that one. But on the other side of the ledger, 66% of the Democrats who supported President Obama in the 2008 election are dead set against the Afghanistan policy. And as members of Congress go home and they seek to have the support of the Democrats and the activists who put them in power in 2008 and 2006, are increasingly finding those very same people skeptical, questioning, wondering why we're going in this direction. And those are the very people that those Democrats are going to need in order to be successful. So we have a very interesting and important dynamic occurring here. One final word on what's happening on Capitol Hill. As a result of this dynamic, Jim McGovern over in the House, Russ Feingold over in the Senate have introduced legislation that would require the president to provide the Congress and with the American people with an exit strategy for Afghanistan. That not only do we want to see the initiation of the redeployment of forces out of Afghanistan in July of 2011, we want to see an end point, and we want to see a strategy to get us from point A to point B. In 2.5 weeks, Jim McGovern's legislation has already generated 83 co-sponsors over in the House.
Please, if you have questions, stand and identify yourselves, and we have a microphone. If you wait for the microphone before asking, please.
Can anybody hear me? There we go. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis. I'm an Army guy who works at DIA at the moment. I have a question. Anybody who feels compelled or qualified to answer, please do so. In 2006, it became clear to a number of people that the strategy in Iraq was not working, and they were going to have to do something to change it, to affect the surge, which later, changed the strategy and everything else to turn it around. In the event that, a number of folks here recognize many of the things you guys have said and said, you know what, this strategy isn't working. How do you change that, especially since the administration has already done 2 reviews and has kind of changed it? How do they now, for a third time, what do they tell the American people, or what do they tell the military, anybody else, and what do they tell them to say, all right, we recognize this isn't working, it's counterproductive, we're going to turn it around to something that's good, and they can fill in the blank of what that is. But politically, how do they do that?
Actually,
No, please, anyone who'd like to respond?
actually, I would defer to the former congressman on that question.
It's a very good question. And I think if you look at the Iraq experience, you see some clues. First of all, the reporting that was coming in from the Pentagon began to get more serious attention from Congress. Congressional hearings started to occur more regularly, both formally and informally. Questions started to be raised during the debates on supplemental appropriations and so forth. But there was also a recognition that to change the political context, we needed to have a wider prism on the war in Iraq. And so legislation was passed that created an independent panel that was bipartisan, that had various people with various levels of experience and expertise that could take a much broader view of Iraq. I think that played the Baker-Hamilton Commission played a very important role in shaping that debate. Now, and interestingly enough, when Ambassador Eikenberry's cables were released in December, all the focus was on his critical comments about President Karzai and him not being able to be an important partner. But what was also in those cables was a recommendation by Ambassador Eikenberry that an independent panel be created that would be interdisciplinary, that would reflect a wide range of views, and that could provide the government and the Congress with a much wider perspective than they're getting from the Pentagon right now. I mean, right now there are quarterly reports that are being required. The Pentagon is providing Congress. I think those are okay. They're getting increasingly critical, but I think we need this wider prism, and that's one of the things, I think, a step that could put this in the right direction. Finally, last but not least, I think having citizens across this country during the course of this election year raising serious questions about this policy and where it's going is going to be absolutely critical.
Hillary Mantel Everett, and then Steve Clements.
It's an important and pretty depressing question, I would say, but and I think the prospects are not good. But given that, I think it's important to also look back to 2006. We similarly had a problematic relationship with the head of state in Iraq, with Maliki. Here, he was routinely dismissed as incompetent and corrupt, running death squads, killing Sunni Muslims all over Baghdad. This was someone who was regarded openly here as someone with contempt that we couldn't possibly work with. But we sucked it up. We worked with him. We had not only a surge in troops, but we had a very focused, determined political strategy that included not only dealing with Maliki as the head of state, regardless of how he got there, regardless of what we saw as his flaws. It also was a focused political strategy dealing with the groups on the ground. And there was a political strategy not to really heighten the tempo, heighten the heat with Iran, so that Iran could also help broker some of the power agreements in the South, in particular among the Shia, which were critically important to that working. Here, I'm afraid that we have burned some of our bridges with the way that we've treated both Karzai and with, even more importantly, with how we've treated some of the critical neighbors. We have our head in the sand in terms of, I think, as Steve Clements has rightfully put it, what is our actual ability to project power and influence there. We refuse to accept the fact that our power is in relative decline, and that there are emerging powers that include, I wouldn't put them at the top of the list, but include, particularly in this neighborhood, Iran, but include, as we're seeing on the Iranian nuclear issue, Turkey, Brazil, a lot of others that are coming to the fore, asserting their voice. We need to take advantage of that, work with them in a very serious, determined way. I'm afraid we've burned some of our bridges, but I worked for Ambassador Holbrooke when he was our ambassador to the United Nations, and I've heard him many, many times recount how he was able to to be steely in his determination to make a deal, even with Milosevic. He needs to regain that steely determination and make a deal not only with Karzai, with the people on the ground in Afghanistan, but suck it up and have the Iranians and the Saudis there in a transparent, constructive way. It'll be very, very difficult, but I think that's what needs to be done.
If I may, that was an excellent question. And I think that in these questions of how do you, after 2 strategic reviews, really the largest, the one we saw last year was the largest strategic review in this country since 1965 of any major issue. And my view is the pivot, you know that bureaucracy, I know that bureaucracy needs a narrative that says we're going to generate as much security and stability as we were. Actually, we're going to do better than we were with an alternative set of issues. And so, to me, I'd like to quote my friend Brian Katulis at the Center for American Progress, very well placed, talks to folks. He talks a lot about the Tom Sawyer strategy, that we need to create other players to bring them in, like Hillary just discussed, to come paint our fence or paint the Afghanistan fence, to draw other players in to carry some of the load and be part of the balancing process. I believe there's no alternative. I was disappointed in the joint statement by Karzai and Obama as far as the way in which the reconciliation and reintegration strategy was defined. Because if you read that carefully, I don't want to get into it now, it almost looks designed not to work on the front end. And I think we need to be very careful of that kind of thing, because we end up creating and preempting necessary organic process which could move forward. But a better reconciliation reintegration strategy, an external stewards conference of external players that have got to become stabilizers, because part of what's going on are the external, the machinery of external meddling from regional powers. I favor something. I'm not a big fan of the sort of philanthropy approach to development, that what is controversial here with labor groups and whatnot, but is, I think, a far more effective way to affect the overall composite of an economy is to look at Europe, Japan, and the United States putting together trade and economic packages that become a much more powerful magnet for economic reorganization inside Afghanistan. I think the United Nations can be used far more effectively for that aid and development piece of this that can be brought in. And then I think that Paul Pillar has taught me much, as Flint Leverett and others, about over-the-horizon security capacity to prevent Afghanistan to falling back into the kind of what you would call a haven. Haven tends to be this thing that gets a lot of play, but when you would look at the training bases that al-Qaeda had in Afghanistan, these were the size of a large Air Force base. They were military bases. The likelihood that those could return in any way, shape, or form is completely preemptible. And I think that if you packaged Tom Sawyer plus this over-the-horizon capacity plus other sorts of rapprochement deals, you could generate a third way that you could arguably say is this is a far better and far more granular and sensible approach to stabilizing and developing a new equilibrium in Afghanistan than we have today.
Matthew Ho, Paul Pillar, any thoughts?
It's an excellent and important question. I have almost nothing to add to the suggestions my colleagues have made. We have to acknowledge, as your question implies, there would still be a significant political vulnerability on the part of the administration, even using all these techniques.
I guess the only thing I'd add to that is that's what makes great leaders, though, who can stand in front of the nation and the world and shift how we're moving forward. So that would be my one comment. He's President of the United States. This is what makes great leaders.
Yes, right here. If you'll wait until the microphone comes. There you go.
Hello. I'm Ray McGovern, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Neither the word oil nor the word gas has been mentioned this morning. I'm wondering if anyone would care to comment on what, if any, influence the huge natural gas fields up in Turkmenistan, for example, just to the north of Afghanistan, might have on the ultimate objectives or involvement there.
I'd like to actually bring that a little bit more broadly. When Hamid Karzai was here in Washington, he put forward this idea that The mineral wealth, for example, in Afghanistan would be a game changer. We've heard this for a long time in Afghanistan, that various natural resources would be game changers in Central Asia. That there's nothing that's going to be a game changer without a political settlement. So I think that has to be first and foremost. There's no amount of money, as Steve Clements alluded to, in terms of any kind of aid injections into Afghanistan. This idea that there's somehow going to be an economic prosperity that's going to take the place of a political strategy, I haven't seen that work really anywhere. And I can't imagine that, having tried it, I think at various times throughout the 30 years of civil war in Afghanistan, that there would be anything different today. That said, I think it is important to also note that, again, what Steve Clements alluded to as well, the rise of these other powers that we used to call the third world, particularly China. It's hard to imagine that we ever thought that. But China is looking very, very closely and acting in a very direct way for its economic interests in Afghanistan. And so while we kind of play around with various military and political strategies and dither back and forth, the Chinese are there in a very determined way to ensure that their economic interests are protected, and they're investing in natural resource development there for them, not at all for our own interests.
Mark Harrison with the United Methodist Church office. Just to Steve Clements on U.S. decline in power, and when I was at the UN 2 weeks ago, a thing that was raised with me was a lot of diplomats saw the U.S. domestic agenda as a way to determine the power of the president. They thought that if Obama didn't get the health care through, that would weaken their thoughts of how much power he had. So I would like to hear your concerns about the domestic agenda on that. The question to Matt, how are you today, is why are so many civilians being killed by the U.S. military in Afghanistan? And do those missiles that are shot out, unmanned missiles that are supposed to hit the enemy, do they really work as well as they claim that they work? And then my last point to Hillary Everett was, you used the interesting terminology, chosen and selected of Karzai. Who chose him and who selected him?
These are all excellent questions. I, of course, only get one, but they're all really good. I would just simply say, look, there are lots of generalities when people talk about power, but I think in terms of trends, the way I look at it, and what I've been watching for a long time, is the United States in this post-Cold War period has had difficulty getting its grounding and groove, if you will, and has 700 plus military installations around the world. It has an ability to project power like no other nation in the world, has intelligence, has lots of power. But in my mind, it kind of looks like GM or Xerox, not Google. And China, in terms of what the expectations of what might be down the road in the future, is changing global gravitational force in a way that we're not today. And so one of the challenges for the United States is to figure that out. Very simply, I look at four equations when you look at the mystique of power. And one of the things I worried, and I was so strongly opposed to the Iraq War, I'm not a pacifist. There are wars I could very well be for. Just want to put that on the table. I used to run the Nixon Center. There are wars that can help generate a momentum or power or needed results, and there are wars that puncture mystique. And when you see, as I did with the Economist for Peace and Security, the biggest changing number through the Clinton period and then up into Bush was the current account deficit. And you saw this giant rise. And I kept saying, what spark, what little pinprick will eventually reveal that there are enormous constraints on what is sort of a globally sprawling, previously hegemonic force. And in my view, we have not got that right. So when I look at the mystique of power militarily showing limits, if you show limits when previously the world didn't really see those limits, it changes the behavior of everyone, allies and foes. And it's very easy, if you look across the spectrum of other players the United States interact with, behavior has changed across the board, everywhere. If you look at economically, and as I said, others, this is all translated, I think, into a perception of weakness. When it comes to what Barack Obama has inherited and how he turns that around, in my view, rewriting a domestic social contract with American citizens is vital to get them reconnected in a way that there's sort of a belief and ability to turn around the country. Healthcare is a small piece of that, but there are many more hurdles. But externally, rewriting a global social contract with other great powers in the world and getting away from anachronistic institutions that no longer fit the way power really flows is another opportunity for Barack Obama to rewire our place and to rewire our leverage in a sense in this. And that may sound very high-flying and cosmic, but it really does matter when you're trying to convince the world that you can do things. Most importantly, I kept telling people that the single most important national security objective that I would put forward, Barack Obama, is accomplish anything. As until the nuclear summit, everything we said was more platitude and not real, that the world became convinced we were unable to actually solve or do anything we set out to do. And that's why I saw the nuclear summit in a very different light. It may be because there's no organized opposition or AIPAC or something like that to it, but it is the only time, in my view, in a major area where Obama on the international stage accomplished something akin to healthcare, which was remending what John Bolton, John Kyle, and others tore down 5 years ago in the sort of nuclear commons, if you will. And it doesn't mean that, life is wonderful now, but it does mean that we need to begin thinking about that ability to convince and show the world that you can accomplish what you're doing, or what we say we're going to do.
Matthew?
Sure. I guess the simple answer, Mark, is it's war. That's what happens. You read about fog and friction, but till you actually experience it, things move very quickly. There are variables that you cannot control. My friend Rajiv, who's in Kandahar right now with the Army, he's with the unit that shot up that bus and killed 5 people about a month or so ago. His explanation, every bus driver that he's ever met in Afghanistan is high. They can't possibly see the flares, they can't possibly see the flags, they can't possibly see all the things we do to try to mitigate and control the circumstances. Until you experience, I know my experiences in Iraq, and I bet there's ladies and gentlemen in this room have had the same experience, where we came very close to killing civilians. And thankfully, the vehicle stopped in time. And it's a terrible position to be in. And war will never change. The idea that you're going to have a cleaner, kinder, gentler war, the idea that you're going to have, particularly with this idea of a counterinsurgency, or some of the tenets of counterinsurgency that people push, that armed foreign troops are somehow going to be embraced by a local population. It's just, I'm not sure what that is based upon in any types of historical context that's valid. I know there's a lot of theory behind it, but in terms of historical context, I don't know if anything's valid. I will say the U.S. military goes beyond any other organization in the history of the world in terms of its discipline and its professionalism and its restraint. But even with the restraint it's showing, civilian casualties are up over 70% this year as at this time last year. It's unfortunately the nature of war. When you increase your operations, these things are going to happen. Restraint is shown by our forces, but it's going to occur. And that's why you shouldn't be taking part in a war unless there's actual legitimate strategic interests behind your purposes. As far as you asked about the missiles, the drones, yeah, they are very accurate. My one comment about the drones will be, where does it get you, though? What's the end of it? Drones are a tactical tool. What strategic purpose do they serve, and where does it end? Are we going to do drone strikes in western Pakistan for the next 30, 40 years? I mean, where has targeted assassinations gotten Israel? I think we need to really understand the difference between a tactical tool and strategic policy.
Hillary, quickly?
Yes. The language was deliberate. Karzai certainly was chosen and selected. He was not brought in as the first post-Taliban head of state in Afghanistan because of any democratic election, any election whatsoever. I think the idea that, we heard recently Secretary of State Clinton saying that she could connect to him as a fellow politician He's not a lifelong politician. He never was experienced in democratic elections. The idea that he's going to suddenly turn that way today, I think ignores the historical record of how he emerged on the scene. He was chosen, selected principally by the United Nations, our special representative to Afghanistan at the time, Lakhdar Brahimi, and his team. And what Lakhdar Brahimi and his team valued most was that Karzai would be acceptable to the key international backers of the Afghan factions, especially the United States, but also Iran, India, Pakistan, Russia, and that Karzai be acceptable to the important warlords. That was the criteria for his selection at the time. And I think the idea that we could go back and say that he was a professional politician who was either experienced in or valued democratic elections as the future for Afghanistan really obscures the historical record. That's not how he has emerged on the scene in Afghanistan. I don't see any evidence that he's ever valued that. What he values, I think that we've seen over and over again, is power sharing and building some minimal level of consensus.
We have time for one more question. Yes, over here.
Hello, my name is Matt Southworth. I work for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and I served a tour in Iraq, Northern Iraq, Mosul with 2ID in 2004. It seems like we're suggesting that any change strategy for the war in Afghanistan is mostly going to be through the executive branch. And I'm wondering if that's what you actually feel. I've spent a lot of time in House offices over the last 3 or 4 weeks, talking to a lot of staff who are my age and have not deployed to a war zone, and they don't seem to get it. In the sense that they don't understand what it really is like being on the ground and the challenges that are faced by soldiers on the ground. So I'm wondering if you all, and anyone can comment on this who feels qualified or able, if this really is an executive branch strategy, and if so, how do we move that forward? And, I like your idea. In fact, I've been working on an Afghanistan study group. A lot of these meetings have been revolving around that and the exit strategy amendment by Mr. Feingold and Mr. McGovern. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. You know, this United States of America is a wonderful place to be living when it comes to challenging power and challenging what you think is going to be insurmountable odds to change a policy. And I think that the engagement and involvement of citizens, number one, through the Congress, is a way historically that we have seen even the strongest commitment of an administration change course. I think the same is true here. President Obama, of course, looked at Afghanistan and used Afghanistan in his campaign for president as a lesson in how the Bush administration had diverted attention away from Afghanistan and toward Iraq and created a disaster. So it was a political issue, number one. Number two, the Obama administration has embraced the militarization of our policy toward Afghanistan, lock, stock, and barrel. Remember, back very early on, when the president announced he was going to have a comprehensive review of Afghanistan, he announced even before that review began the escalation of 21,000 troops in order to safeguard the Afghan national elections. And then, of course, he announced back in March at West Point the escalation of 33,000 troops. This is a military-led operation. And I think the president, for many reasons, has been persuaded that this is the only way to create the kind of security and stability required to create an exit possibility for the United States. I think the evidence is exactly the opposite. I think the more we've escalated, and I think the record is showing, and the studies, even from the Pentagon, are showing more and more that this militarization of this policy is in fact counterproductive to the ends of this administration. The only way to get that across is to create the political conditions in which the administration can see room to move and room to change policy. There's enormous pressure coming from the right. As I mentioned, this is the one policy that the Republicans in Congress are not attacking the president on. There's enormous pressure for him among hawkish Democrats to move in this direction. It's going to be through organizing, through engaging members of Congress and using this campaign season as a vehicle, as well as legislation like Jim McGovern's legislation and Russ Feingold's legislation, to have this kind of debate that we need and to begin to build the political climate required for the president to change course.
Just very briefly, one of the things I find so intriguing about this debate is the degree to which it's a public relations battle here in Washington that seems somewhat detached from the realities that are happening over. I had an opportunity. I don't know if it was a year ago, 9 months ago. Carl Levin, Senator Levin, was coming back with Al Franken from the region, and he had been led on a tour by General McChrystal's staff. This was after the West Point speech. But not soon enough that you'd had a very large uptick in the number of troops that had been deployed. But he hadn't fought that, and I guess the Pentagon handlers that were dealing with him at that point weren't thinking about what impact it would be if Levin, who had been a skeptic, had all of a sudden become a big cheerleader for all the gains they had made, that they could see the benefits of partnering, that they could see a sea change in the behavior of the Afghan government and the attitude of new recruits and the need for trainers, et cetera, and Carl Levin, I think, gave an honest picture of what he thought he saw. The issue is he saw something that had been pretty sculpted, and I raised the question of why then do we need to send 30,000 more troops? We had 1,500 Marines, but there had been no substantive change at all in terms of the number of troops deployed between there, and except President Obama's speech. And the 1,500 troops, and he kind of walked back and he said, you know, we made it. It's to some degree a function of public relations sculpting, and I think that's there. And in terms of a strategy of change, I mentioned this before. I'd love to talk to this gentleman. I'm really impressed with the debate going on inside the Pentagon right now. There is a debate going on in the Pentagon. We may not see it. It may look. You may think General McChrystal controls all the pieces here. Not true. There's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of effort to bring in counter opinion and whatnot going on there. I also think in the executive branch there are factions that matter. That doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it, but I would love to see, if you can influence the executive department, you can have a much bigger, faster, dramatic change. If we get Tom Andrews and others to change the way Congress looks at things and create the political climate, you've got to work on multiple fronts. So I see these as sort of hand in glove.
Would any of our other panelists like to weigh in on that topic?
I'll just say, as an outsider to how D.C. works, I think the importance with the legislative branch is they're not receiving the information that they should be, and they're not doing. And I've been on the presenting end of CODELs and staff DELs in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and they get shown PowerPoint slides. They get taken to Potemkin villages, and everything falls along the lines of good news stories only. I met with a key committee chairman about a month and a half ago, and he said, and this is a very key committee for this debate, and he said, you know, Matt, I just came from another brief. We just got another briefing from the Pentagon, and while things aren't going so well, success is around the corner. And I said, Mr. Chairman, when in the last 9 years have you not received a brief like that? You know, and you see how a lot of issues are packaged. The report Tom brought up, where 90-some odd districts out of 121 in Afghanistan are sympathetic or supportive for the Taliban. Well, if you watch the House Armed Services Committee hearing on that report, the General Paxton and Ms. Flournoy, that was the very definition of rose-colored glasses. If you take the time to look at this report, 157 pages, somehow the conclusion is that stability is occurring. Well, U.S. combat deaths are 3 times as high as they were this time last year. Afghan civilian casualties are up 75% over this time last year. As Tom discussed, there is no evidence of stability occurring in Marja. In Kandahar, 84% of the population, according to a U.S. study, see the Taliban as their Afghan brothers, and 95% want negotiations rather than more offensives. Another study was just done in Helmand. 70% of the people in Helmand province want NATO to leave, but somehow stability and success is occurring. So I think the key thing for our members of Congress is to get accurate information that is not being filtered by the administration and by senior levels at DOD and Department of State.
We'll be moving directly to our keynote speaker, Ambassador Peter Galbraith. As we do so, please join me in thanking our panelists for this morning's discussion.